Hey kings and queens. Today we're going to talk about one of the most misunderstood films in recent memory, Starship Troopers. Starship Troopers is a 1997 science fiction action film. It's available on Netflix right now or very cheaply on Amazon Prime. Starship Troopers is ultimately a movie about government propaganda, so there's really no better time to watch it than in the election year of 2020. There are roughly 4 things I want to talk about with this movie. I want to talk about the incredible creature design and really great costume design in this movie. I want to talk about Starship Troopers' manipulation of storytelling tropes. And then I want to talk about the over-the-top setting in this movie and maybe some key moments that I like, which might degenerate to me just listing my favorite parts in the movie, but if it gets to that point, I'll try to wrap it up. Starship Troopers is a film adaptation of a 1959 novel written by Robert Heinlein. The story is set in the near future where all the humans on Earth have finally been united under a government known as the United Citizen Federation. Under the Federation, citizenship is only given to people who enlist in the military, and that's needed because the Federation is in a constant war with an alien race referred to as the Bugs. They constantly need new recruits to keep the war effort going, so a lot of the society is militarized and everybody gets funneled into service. Now, there are some key differences between the novel and the film that are worth pointing out. The film is basically a black comedy. It depicts the Federation's militarism and dedication to citizenship as basically fascism, and this is to be expected if you're familiar with the director, Paul Verhoeven, who is one of the most effective PLEB filters in the industry. He makes a lot of satirical works, things like RoboCop, and by the time he got to Starship Troopers, I guess he was too good at it, because some number of people didn't realize that Starship Troopers was a satire. The novel, on the other hand, was written at the end of the Americana Eisenhower era of America, where conservatism was being replaced as the most popular philosophy with a lot of hippie culture and what we now know and understand to be the 1960s. The author of this book really truly believed that society was going astray and citizens were losing their sense of obligation to things like civic duty. And with that in mind, the book genuinely argued for things like capital punishment to root out delinquency at an early age before it spiraled out into a person's life and into the rest of the world. So this might be obvious, but the novel was not a satire. It really genuinely argues for things like getting whipped in a public square to sort of get people out of their bad habits. Maybe you could have made an argument for that some 70 years ago when this book was written, but today it definitely sounds psychotic. So not so surprisingly, Paul Verhoeven, who grew up in Nazi-occupied Denmark, read the novel and was appropriately horrified, so he made this movie making fun of it. And it is fantastic. Starship Troopers follows the story of Johnny Rico. He is a student of the Federation who decides to enlist in the military after a professor gives him some challenging ideas he isn't certain what to think of. That professor is played by Michael Ironside, and he is introduced in one of the early scenes when Rico and his fellow students are taught that not only is violence the most effective tool of persuasion, but it's proven by the fact that everybody at Hiroshima was nuked out of existence. This is genuinely the argument that shows up in the movie, and I think now would be a good time to mention that a lot of people didn't know that Starship Troopers was a satire when it was first released in 1997. It got a mixed response from critics, a lot of people saying that it was a brain-dead action movie with some, quote, juvenile ideas. I have to say, if you are watching an action movie and the opening scene applauds the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you might want to consider that maybe it's a satire. Rico also has a girlfriend named Carmen and a friend named Carl, and we get to see their paths as they go into the military. Carmen becomes a pilot, and you see her quite a bit in the movie. Carl joins command, and you don't see him till the end of the movie, but you do get a little slice of what it's like to be in his position compared to Carmen and Rico, who decides to join the infantry.
What about you, son?
Infantry, sir.
Good for you. Mobile infantry made me the man I am today.
The first thing I want to commend this movie for is its incredible creature design and really hilarious costume design. This movie is ultimately about propaganda and fascism, and neither of those things can be effective unless you really hate the enemy that you're fighting against. You can look up real-world historical propaganda, and you see a common tactic is to portray your country as like perfect, and the enemy country as disgusting and gross and worthy of being killed. I can think of one specific example where there was American propaganda that showed the American soldier, and it showed Japanese soldiers, and it sort of nitpicked what their face looks like and compared them to vermin like rats or insects. And this is really common across all of time, to really activate the part of your monkey brain that feels disgust for something so that you're more psychologically capable of literally killing it. So it is a stroke of pure genius that the enemies in Starship Troopers are literal bugs. And they're not just bugs, they are one of the most grotesque beings I've ever seen. For starters, their base color seems to be this infection-colored dark green. They break that up with this irregular, jagged yellow line that doesn't seem to have any perceivable pattern. So immediately they're gross looking and you can't get a full sense of what they look like. They seem to have an imperceivable number of legs. You're not certain if it's 6 or 4 or 8 or 12. And it doesn't help that every single one of those limbs seem to be serrated and can cause serious bodily harm. Even the creature's, let's call it a mouth, seems to be a giant razor-sharp nutcracker. Their mouth is over half the size of their body, and there's really no soft or rounded edge anywhere in their anatomy. It's all just very threatening looking. And finally, they have no eyes or any anatomy to express that they are feeling any emotion or capable of feeling any emotion other than just violent bloodlust. And even with that in mind, their bloodlust isn't like an intelligent bloodlust. They're not using tools or guns or weapons. They just mindlessly toss themselves and pile onto soldiers and buildings until they can rip everything to shreds. This design is so effective because it just immediately makes you hate these bugs. You don't need some bug villain character talking about how they believe in eugenics or some contrived reason why you would dislike them. You don't need a main character getting killed by the bugs to dislike them. You just see them and you're like, okay, well, these things clearly need to be exterminated. And the extent of that is just so absurd that it really feeds into the satirical tone of this movie. Like, it's just so absurd how gross looking these things are that it becomes ridiculous and something you can laugh at. I also really like the costume design in this movie, especially with the Federation soldiers. For the first hour, you could be forgiven if you didn't think much beyond it's just generic military garb. But by the time you get to the end of the movie, it's just so clear that they're meant to represent Nazis. It's really not subtle at all. If you're on the same page with the movie with its satire, it's just a great punchline to finally see Rico's friend Carl again, and he just looks like Amon Goth. Paying attention to what this movie is doing is really rewarded because you can see how a lot of it is a manipulation of storytelling tropes. In previous videos, I've talked about the hero's journey format and how Hollywood over-relies on that format a little too much. Starship Troopers is also a hero's journey format. One of the things I've thought with the hero's journey is you could make it more interesting if you used it to express how the format doesn't have any inherent morality, even though it uses terms like hero to describe itself. Technically, you could make a, quote, hero's journey about a horrible person who becomes even more effective in this horribleness. Starship Troopers doesn't exactly do that, but it gets as close as you'd probably want it to. It's all about Rico becoming a citizen by enlisting in the military, and that necessarily means getting brainwashed and highly valuing things like jingoism or a class-based populism. Throughout Starship Troopers, the people that are depicted as paragons of virtue are always the most blindly loyal psychos. Meanwhile, the more non-violent, reasonable people are depicted as just idiotic pieces of shit.
And force, my friends, is violence, the supreme authority from which all other authority is derived.
My mother always said violence never solves anything.
Really? I wonder what the city fathers of Hiroshima would say about that.
One of the early obstacles for Rico is he wants to enlist, but his father doesn't approve. His father's reasoning is not only that, quote, people get killed there, but specifically he wants Rico to go to Harvard instead. I'm not certain if people in 1997 were hip to the idea that you could build a lot of resentment for someone because they want their children to go to an Ivy League school, but in 2020, it's pretty believable. So in that dynamic, the father that doesn't want his kid to just be a killing machine, that is the force of evil preventing the hero from going on the journey that the audience wants him to take. There's another instance of this later in the movie where the, quote, refusal of the call, which is another hero's journey thing, is when Rico has some failures at training, and his concern is not that he is going down a path of murder and death and suffering, but that he's not living up to what a true citizen of the Federation should be, which is already a corrupted version of what a refusal of the call should be about. I mean, Rico should be questioning whether he can take on the responsibility responsibility of something really important, or he has some commitments to somebody at home that's keeping him there and he can't go off gallivanting on some random thing. And ultimately, the thing that lets him cross the threshold to this military service is when his hometown is attacked, and that event radicalizes his worldview so that he has just become completely in tune with the militarized propaganda and wants to get out and kill bugs. This is really amazingly represented in the movie when Rico walks by a reporter who is suggesting that maybe the humans are the aggressor of this war since they invaded the bugs' territory and didn't try to communicate with them in any way. And Rico interrupts this interview with one of the more memorable lines of the movie.
Some say the bugs were provoked by the intrusion of humans into their natural habitat, that a live and let live policy is preferable to war with the bugs.
Let me tell you something. I'm from Buenos Aires, and I say kill them all! Yeah! Oh yeah! Yeah! Oh yeah!
The tone of this scene is what you would expect from a YouTube video called Libtard Gets Owned by Veteran. You know, he has just such emotional righteousness in his delivery. You feel like he's right in that exchange when he's obviously not. And I should say that the propaganda in this movie is shockingly effective. Even as someone who was rewatching this movie, knowing what the whole thing is about, I had to take a few moments and sort of, stop and reflect and ask yourself some questions. Why do I love these characters so much? Why do I feel no empathy at all for these villains? And that's ultimately the reason why I dislike Hollywood storytelling tropes, because in my opinion, storytelling should really be, for lack of a better terminology, some expression of the human soul or maybe of the human experience. But these formats and tropes don't necessarily do that. Things like the hero's journey are kind of more about the art of manipulation. It's how to make a person likable or how to make an idea attractive without actually addressing the inherent value of those people or those ideas. It's just depicting them in such a way that intuitively resonates with your emotional biases. Someone is depicted as likable, so you immediately like them. Someone is depicted as unlikable and you immediately dislike them, even if it's something as simple as saving a cat or kicking a cat. That makes all the difference between whether or not you're okay with the character or living to the end of the movie or getting retribution for some other thing. I don't think this movie intended to be a criticism on these tropes, but it is a good discussion point for that conversation. Another thing I love about this movie is the over-the-top setting, and again, this may just devolve into me naming parts of the movie that I really like. One of the best parts of this movie are the propaganda commercials that start the movie and also appear again during the transitions of the major acts of this film. My personal favorite is one of the early ones where soldiers are passing out bullets to children. This is followed by an announcement of a public execution where you see the guy get ruled guilty and you see a picture of a really gross looking chair in a sterile environment. It's just all so absurd and made even funnier by the fact that people didn't know that this movie was supposed to be a joke. I'm just imagining what were those people thinking during these scenes. But those commercials are really effective at setting the tone of the movie, which might otherwise be a little harder to detect if you were just looking at the story of Rico and his friends. Speaking of Rico's friends, the casting decisions in this movie seem like a creative decision to make everything appear more ridiculous. Maybe Casper Van Dien and Denise Richards are very kind, intelligent people, but they look like total morons. Actually, a significant portion of the cast has blonde hair and blue eyes. I have to imagine this was not an accident. And I also like that pretty much every scene in this movie has this overbearing fill light. A fill light is typically used to get rid of really harsh looking shadows, usually because you want to make the actor's face look good, but there are some instances where a harsh shadow can look too dramatic, or it can be really distracting, or just look plain bad. Fill lights are frequently overused in soap operas because they want the actors to look really pretty for sex appeal. This movie basically looks like a soap opera. Like, no matter where you are in the universe, whether you're in a classroom or in an alien cave, there's just this really nice soft light on everything. This might be something that people wouldn't typically notice, but for me it shows that the satirical nature of this movie was created with a lot of intent. I also really love how the world's commitment to militarism is just so ruthless. There is no sense that anyone in the military in this movie wants to teach lessons so that people can rise to their natural potential. Instead, all the leaders of this movie seem like uncompromising assholes who seem willing to brutally injure their subordinates to show them their inherent incompetency. Two scenes that stick out. There's this scene where Diz, one of Rico's friends, decides to challenge one of the drill sergeants, and she does pretty okay, but she gets taken out and he puts his knee on her neck, and it sort of cuts away from there. But later you see Diz in the cafeteria and she has like this horrific bruising on the side of her neck, showing that the guy didn't go easy on her at all. And the ruthlessness is especially funny when you consider there's basically no old people in this universe. The handful that you see are either blind or dismembered in some way. And by the end of the movie, Rico actually comes into contact with a fresh new squad of recruits. Like, everybody in this world is just an expendable sacrifice to the war machine. I'm basically just saying my favorite parts of this movie, so let's just say we're at the last category at this point. I really liked the cult of collectivism in this movie. At no point is an individual celebrated, or even the concept of individuality. That's never celebrated. It's all in service to the Federation. Literally, one of the catchphrases by the end of this movie is, "Do you want to live forever?" As if wanting to preserve your life is worth mocking. They really land on this point when one of Rico's friends die and he has to give a eulogy, which would typically be a great moment for Rico to reconsider if maybe he's on the right path. He just saw his friend die. Maybe he should be doing something else with his life. But that is not what happens in this movie. Rico's parting words to his friend are, "Not only were they my friend, not only did I love them, but more importantly, they were a citizen of the Federation." As if no friendship or personal intimacy can compare to the importance of being a radicalized military drone. Which speaks to the last thing I wanted to say, which to me, the coup de grace of this movie is that the depicted antagonist of this movie is something called a brain bug. This is a bug that the heroes are so scared of, specifically because it can jam itself into your brain, suck all your brains out, and read your thoughts. And the tone of it is kind of like, man, what could be worse than getting brainwashed? Good thing that didn't happen to us. That's just a really great wink at the audience for anyone paying attention. I could probably endlessly list my favorite scenes in this movie, but it would just be an oral retelling of something you could easily go watch. If I have any criticisms for this movie, the second half has a lot of action scenes, and if you've seen it before or are just kind of tired of action scenes in general, especially from the late 90s, it is a little dull. There's not as much satire to enjoy, but a lot of the best moments of the movie come at the very end, so it's worth sticking through it. It is kind of nice to watch a movie like Starship Troopers because it is so blatant about its propaganda that it almost makes you more aware of the real world propaganda that we have in our own everyday life. Granted, a lot of that is self-inflicted these days. It gives you an opportunity to have a sense of clarity as you get to see what real propaganda looks like in a different universe, so it's a lot more obvious. And I don't know, I just felt kind of a weight lift off me when I saw this movie, and suddenly the world seemed so much more ridiculous. Maybe that's just nihilism. I guess it has its uses in some cases. Starship Troopers is available on Netflix right now. It's also pretty cheap on Amazon Prime. I think you should definitely check it out. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching my Starship Troopers video. I would appreciate your feedback if you liked this video by either pressing the like button or leaving a comment to help my self-esteem. If you really want to encourage me to make more videos, you can go over to my YouTube channel and subscribe to that, or you can consider donating to my Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can help fund these videos, or more importantly, tell me that I should spend more time making them so I can make more of these videos for you guys. But if you don't have the money or don't want to, that's totally fine. I just hope people keep watching this stuff and keep engaging with these reviews, because I really do like making them. Stay strong, Royals. Thanks so much.